Welcome, everybody, to In Bad Faith. I'm your host, Jeff Jones, and with me today is Katherine Judson from the Center of Integrity in Forensic Sciences. Thanks for being with me here today, Katherine.
Thanks for having me.
Do you prefer Kate or Katherine?
I go by Kate.
Do you? Okay.
Yeah.
So it's great to have you here. A lot of people I was highly anticipating this interview, really excited to get you on here and ask you a few questions. Some of these questions you might have answered in other interviews, and I know that you have been on some lives and YouTubes, and that's great to see you out there. So first off, can you just give us a little brief history on the center?
Yeah, absolutely. Our center was started in 2018 by Dean Strang, Jerry Buting, and Keith Finley. They're familiar names to most because of their work on Stephen Avery's case. But they're also, and importantly, longstanding lawyers in Wisconsin and elsewhere, who have become very concerned over the years about the use of science in the courtroom and how it can be misused and misleading.
That's great. So what year did it form?
2018.
2018. Okay, so yeah,
Yeah.
relatively new. You guys are still in your infancy, let's say, right?
Yeah, we're very new. I started in 2019, so we didn't have any staff in the first year of our existence, but now we do.
Okay, that's great. And what do you guys what's your day-to-day work like there?
It's often not the same thing twice, right? So I do a lot of training of lawyers. I present CLEs and do consultation with lawyers who are facing these issues. I work with experts. We do some direct representation of clients, though not a ton. And then we do a bunch of advocacy work through things like amicus briefs, friend of the court briefs. That means that if there's an important issue, in a court, we might be asked either by the court or by one of the parties to weigh in and to not as an advocate necessarily for one of the parties, but as an advocate for the science.
See, that's great. So yeah, it just seems like a mixed bag. You have all sorts of different things going on there. Would you say that you had a mission statement? Do you have something like that?
Sure. I mean, our mission statement is that we want to improve the quality of scientific evidence that comes into the courtroom. We want to make sure everyone gets a fair trial and that nobody is convicted because of evidence that's false or misleading.
Cool. So like, what are you seeing? I know I gave you some questions to prepare for, but I might just go off a little bit. What are you seeing? Are there examples of like this particular problem continues to arise, or does it seem like most cases are it's a mixed bag, you would say, of different instances? Or what do you say, we have a lot of trouble with blood collection, or you have a lot of trouble with this certain type of evidence collection, or is there?
I would say the thing that overarches all of the problems with the forensic science disciplines, it tends to boil down to overstatement of evidence. So a misstatement by an analyst or a prosecutor of what the evidence actually shows. And that can come up in a variety of ways. It can be an assertion that a result is more reliable than it is. And typically, that's what it comes down to, an assertion that evidence is more relevant than it is, that we can dig a little bit more into some of the issues with small quantities of DNA. But for example, if your DNA is found on a doorknob that 15 other people have touched, what's the relevance of that, right? And so misstatements of the reliability or relevance of evidence tend to overarch all of the problems. And then one of the things we're really concerned about is a lack of foundational validity, a lack of basic solid science underlying these forensic science disciplines.
Interesting. Okay, so I understand. I see where you're going with that. Can you answer the question?
If you're asking about a specific discipline, right? I mean, yeah, we can say that bite marks are nonsense and people shouldn't be using bite marks to identify people, right? That's 100% true. It's not, I mean, I hardly ever say 100%, but it is true, right? that bite marks have been used to wrongfully convict people, and there is not evidence that they are useful in the investigation of or prosecution of crimes, right? So we should not be using them. But when you look at the number of people, it's hard to identify one thing that is the biggest problem, because when you look at the number of people who've been wrongfully convicted based on testimony about bite marks, right? It's a much smaller number than what we suspect might be true of people who've been wrongfully convicted based on overstatement of, firearm conclusions, firearm analysis conclusions, simply because, or overstatement of conclusions about blood alcohol level from a breathalyzer, or overstatement of conclusions about, certain kinds of drug testing, right? And so it's hard to say what the biggest problem is. It's easy to point to egregious examples, and it's easy to point to bare numbers, right? But that that value judgment is tricky.
Okay, that's a wonderful answer. It gives me some more to think about, if anything else. This is a question that I gave you previously. It's like, why should people care about evidence collection, storage, and forensic sciences in general?
Yeah, well, people should care about forensic evidence because it can affect you. The main way that we talk about in our organization is that you have control over whether or not you commit a crime. You have no control over whether someone accuses you of a crime. And so for that reason, innocent, you can understand how innocent people are accused and how you or someone you care about could be accused. It's also important because if you're the victim of a crime, or if you have a loved one who's the victim of a crime, you want to make sure that the person who, committed that crime is brought to justice and isn't free to victimize other people. And finally, as a society, we have an interest in being sure that our criminal justice system works and that it's reliable. And that's true for average people walking around on the street in all situations. It's particularly true of people who who might be called to serve on a jury. It's true of many of us, of all of us, really. And so that's why it's critical that we can trust the results of the system.
Yeah, I agree. Just I think about excuse me, people who, think about any time in your life. I would say all of us, if not almost all of us, have been accused of doing something we didn't do at some point in our life. It's just we don't all end up in a courtroom because of it. And I think if you think about that psychology of human nature, and to say, well, you've been accused of stuff you didn't do before, and you're like, yeah, I didn't do it. I don't know why they thought I did it. It made no sense, right? And like just take that experience and put it into a courtroom. And so we see that everywhere. We see, and that's why getting physical evidence right and collecting it properly is paramount, right? Yeah.
And it goes more, it's more broad than collecting it appropriately, but I think collecting it appropriately is a good first step to making sure that we are analyzing and using it appropriately.
So what would be the major problem that we're seeing? Is it resources? Is it the fact that, some of these jurisdictions just don't have the best tools? They don't have the latest technologies in evidence collection. Is it an issue of resources that could be fixed? Is it training, or is it everything? Right? It's just like, well, yes, we need better training. We need to make sure that people are getting funding, but it seems to me that a lot of times it comes down to resources.
I think that's true, but I think just like any other sticky, difficult societal problem, it's multifactorial. So yes, there need to be more resources devoted to making sure that the evidence that comes into our courtrooms is true, is reliable. But it's also, really a human. There are so many human factor errors, right? So people's biases, known or unknown, people's motivations, all of these things can really change the outcome of reform and of a case, and of individual cases and of reform in general is really what I mean to say. And I'll give you an example of that. So in 2009 and again in 2016, government organizations reviewed the available strong scientific evidence that was available to us about forensic science disciplines. And what those bodies found is that we do not have foundational validity for these disciplines in far too many cases. And each time, those who relied upon the existing technology and science treated those reports with intense hostility, from, denying that there's a problem, including, one of the statements by, law enforcement was that they were confident that forensic science, when used properly, was without the flaws that these government bodies were insisting that it had. And of course, that was the point of the study, right? The study showed that that was not the case. And so I think there's a lot going on with institutional inertia, with human factors, and this confluence of things makes reform particularly problematic and
You can
difficult.
see that no one likes to be called out. No one likes to be told that they didn't do a good job, or no one likes to be checked, right? I
Right.
think that that's an attitude that we need to throw out the window. We need to say, no, if I did something wrong, please check me, correct me. I want to make sure we get the right result. Instead, we have egos to deal with, right? That doesn't make any
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, and we, if you look at what goes on in like eyewitness identification, for a long time we didn't understand that it's actually really harmful to tell somebody who gave an eyewitness identification that they did a good job. And it feels good to the person who's saying it, and it feels good to the person who made the ID, but that's actually something that can, after the fact, change the person's perception of what they saw.
Mm.
And so even these well-meaning things are, can cause problems with objectivity, with all sorts of other things, right? And so that ends up being a really serious issue that we cannot ignore.
I think eyewitness testimony has, in my mind, become less and less valuable in court cases. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but if we take the recent example of Brian Laundrie, we can see that how many people thought they saw him and would
Right.
swear to an affidavit that they saw him. Oh, I locked eyes with him. Well, now we know he was dead for 4 weeks. It couldn't have been him. And so
I wouldn't
Howard,
necessarily say that it's less important or less valuable, but I would say that people now are understanding the ways in which it can be flawed.
right,
Right.
and
And so there's at least a response.
yeah, right. It's like one piece, right? Your whole case shouldn't rely on this one witness testimony, in my mind. Now, I'm not a lawyer. Maybe you
Right.
can correct me, but it needs to be, a multifaceted evidentiary file, right? It can't just be, well, she saw you, so it must have been you. We don't really
Yeah.
want cases to go like that, do we?
Sometimes that's the evidence that you have, and there are reasons to go forward with a case like that. But I think the most important thing, rather than making blanket statements about what types of cases should and shouldn't be brought, that we instead insist that what does come in is reliable and true to the best of our ability, right? And we know that science is going to change, because, for example, the innocence movement has taught us all these amazing lessons that we did not know before the advent of single source DNA testing in criminal cases. So there were all these cases in which, if you look at the National Registry of Exonerations, you can see that in the nearly 3,000 cases that are there, many of them involve changes in either science or belief. So when somebody confesses to a crime and later the DNA shows that they weren't present, that they didn't do it, that allows us of course, the critically important part of that is that an innocent person goes free, right? And that hopefully the person who really committed the crime is brought to justice, and the person who is the victim has some modicum of relief related to that. But at a societal level, what that really does is shows us these examples that confessions can be false. Have you ever heard the old adage about disproving a hypothesis, where if you had never been to Australia and you were not aware that there were black swans, you might say swans are only ever white. There's no such thing as a black swan. But it would only take one to disprove your hypothesis. And so, I mean, obviously in the innocence movement, there are lots and lots of examples, but even though the number of examples is small, the fact that they exist tells us that we have these existing problems. And the same thing was true with forensic science evidence. We used to think that hair comparison analysis was reliable, right? And now, because of post-conviction DNA testing that exonerated people, we're aware that this is not a reliable type of forensic science evidence anymore. And what's critical about learning these lessons is that forensic science is moving forward every day. So rather than having to go back, right, and correct these wrongs after people's lives have been ruined and families are in shambles and communities are damaged and all the terrible things, we need to apply these lessons going forward as well, right? So it's really important to us that we can go back and look and let the innocent people free, but it's also super important that we learn these lessons and we apply them moving forward.
I mean, and moving forward in a lot of ways would be easier, right? It's not easy to go back and fix these cases of the past, right? It's very difficult, long work. But if you change the policies and you improve the policies, you improve procedures, you have a chance at stopping those before they start.
Yeah. And I mean, one thing that I don't know if people understand is that, and I'm trying to talk more about this, is that by and large, the people who get exonerated of, the people who were in prison for crimes they didn't commit and become exonerated, there's a heavy dose of chance there, because not that the lawyers aren't skilled and the people don't advocate for themselves. I mean, all of that stuff is true, right? But in order to get exonerated, some things have to happen, right? You have to have an innocence effort in your area who will take your case. You have to be one of thousands who apply every year to have their case taken, and you have to have the right factors present in your case, both factual and legal, to be a good case for an innocence effort to litigate. Sometimes we get cases and we know you're innocent, but there's nothing we can do because of all sorts of bizarre legal kind of machinations. It also requires, in many cases, being able to, for example, fill out an application, which is not accessible for everyone. I don't think people really recognize how many people in our jails and prisons have a disability. And sometimes those disabilities can preclude you from being able to talk on the phone or fill out an application. You have to have access to information about your case, which you might not have. And so you can see how, even though in no way do I want to diminish the hard work of lawyers that goes into getting people exonerated, and I'm very proud of the people who I've helped exonerate, I do understand that there are structural issues that mean that who gets exonerated has a bigger dose of chance in it than I think we really think about very often.
Well, I think, yeah, that's a lot to take in there. That the one thing that I pulled out of there is that it's really disheartening to hear you say that. It's the reality that you see cases and you go, these people are innocent, but there's legally nothing anyone, not me, anyone can do. And that's why it's so important to get it right the first time.
Precisely.
Right.
That's right. That's right. And then we don't miss all those people. We don't have these exonerations that, while wonderful, are based in some way on chance. And that means that we leave people behind in this unjust situation. And if we could prevent it before it happened, we would at least minimize that.
Right. Something that I've been talking with on the other podcasts that I do on the weekdays is, the people who are on the fringes of society,
right,
are the people who get targeted for crimes, and the people who are on the fringes of society are the ones who don't have a good defense when it comes to law. And so it's the downtrodden, the people who maybe are low income, maybe they don't, like, as you said, some of these people are disabled, some of these people couldn't fill out an application, and so they're the most vulnerable at every aspect in the world, right? They're most vulnerable to have a crime committed against them. And if they are accused of a crime, they're most vulnerable because they can't afford defense or even understand what it would be to try to get someone to help them, right? Or to look for help, right?
Yeah, and it's more expansive than that, because even even though everything you've said is true, it's also true that when we have a system that builds upon the decisions made at another point in the system, the harm gets compounded. So I'll give you an example of what I mean. People of color, people experiencing poverty and homelessness, people who are LGBTQ, people who are women or women presenting, are often at the getting the short end of the stick in so many of these situations, right? And if that happens, then let's say the police arrest somebody, their biases played a role in arresting that person. They will then, if they have the opportunity to relay their story to, for example, a forensic analyst, they will often also, without meaning to most of the time, relay their biases. So you see this kind of game of telephone happen, and it really compounds the harm.
There are so many instances that I can think of off the top of my head where that is true, where, one officer says this to the other officer, and then I just saw an instance this summer of this couple left a bar, and the hood, like the windshield of their car had been smashed, and someone was in the same area. I think the car had been stolen and there was a hit and run, and then they just parked the car back where they found it. Well, they just keyed in on this couple that was leaving the bar. They said, "You've been drinking. We know you did it. We know that." And so he relayed that to the next officer, and the officer goes, "Well, as far as we're concerned, you were the one that did the hit and run." And then the security camera showed them in the bar the whole time and leaving when this was going on. So you can see that in case after case where there's this information bias, there's professional biases, or whatever you want to call it, right? That just, it's like you said, telephone.
Well, and
Very
here's an
unfortunate.
example of how it happens in these subjective forensic decision-making cases. So someone dies by suicide, and police or other investigators hone in on their partner, because often intimate partners do homicides, right? If somebody dies, their intimate partner is a good person to start looking at. Even, they may not have done it.
Right.
It doesn't mean they did, but they're a place to start your
I
investigation.
would argue they should always be investigated. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
A place to start your investigation for sure. And that person is experiencing all of the things that we know lead to a wrongful conviction: shock, depression, grief, all of these powerful emotions. And the police say to that person, "We know you did it. Just tell us that you did it, and we'll take it easy on you." So the person confesses. Then there's an autopsy. At the autopsy, the pathologist is told the partner confessed. And so how hard is the pathologist going to look to figure out whether it was suicide or homicide? Even if they are objective, even if they're trying to be objective, we know that your biases, even if you don't want them to, affect your decision making.
So would you say, like, there needs to be more, I don't know, a wall? There needs to be a brick wall between these medical examiners, forensic pathologists, etc., and the law enforcement that's securing the evidence and delivering it? Because if you put on that tag that says whatever direction, there should never be a direction there from a detective ever. In fact, they should have minimal information, because the case has nothing to do with what they find, right? Like, they find it and then they return it, and then they take that evidence and put it back into the case. But what we're seeing is, hey, see if you can put her in the garage, etc., right? Like, see if you can.
Right. So there are a lot of different ideas for how to minimize these kinds of biases. And I don't purport to know for sure which one would be the best, but I can tell you a little bit about some ideas that people have had. So one thing that seems to show real promise and that we've advocated for before is a technique called linear sequential unmasking. It's a technique that understands that analysts and other decision makers will sometimes need to have contextual evidence about the case, but maybe they don't need to have it right up front. Maybe they need to conduct certain portions of their analysis and then receive more information and then conduct more parts of their analysis. So in a nutshell, that's what we're talking about. Some crime labs have taken, I would say it's not enough of a step, but some crime labs have taken the important and critical step of having a person between the investigator and the analyst. So the investigators come to, they have different names, but the investigators come to this officer, right? And they say, here's the crime we're investigating. Here's the evidence we found. We think it's an armed robbery, and we think that the person who did the armed robbery touched this object, right? And so then without giving textual, potentially biasing information, the middleman, for lack of a better term, the middle person can say to the analyst, what you're going to need to do is look at this object for fingerprints and swab this portion of it for DNA, right? And so that allows you to do an objective look at the evidence. And again, like, this is kind of low hanging fruit. This is like an easy thing that people can just, I mean, I'm being kind of flippant about it, but this is not a hard thing to implement, to just put that wall between the investigators and the analysts. It doesn't solve all the problems, but it certainly solves, a pretty significant one.
I think it's a great point. It's like, if you look at other professional disciplines, when I used to review journals for publication, I didn't know who the person was. I didn't know their background. They took the name off of it. They took, right? Like, the only thing that I knew about it was what was in front of me, the content in front of me. I don't need a backstory. That's not, and it would be inappropriate for me to have a backstory or their name, right? That's why it's stripped out. If you're let's say you're in higher level of government and you have some top secret things that you're working on, that's actually what you described. Is we give you enough information for you to do your job now, and then when you finish, we give you a little bit more, and then you do that task. And it's done on purpose for compartmentalizing things, so you don't have to give the whole story to everybody all at once, because you don't know. And that goes back to this word integrity, right? The integrity. I think, are you there? I might have lost you. Oh, okay. I thought I couldn't hear you, and I was like, no, don't.
No, I
break
said
out on
right.
me now.
I just said it quietly.
No, it's fine.
That's true. You're right.
Great. So I did have some other questions that came up from some people who submitted some things to me. So here's a good one. It's like, what do you see the role of social media and citizens active, like, advocacy, I guess, in the justice process? Or or if you want to, you could play into how can social media help. Hit that first. Just like, what do you see the role of this in advocacy for the justice process?
Yeah, I'm not an expert in social media, but I think that just like so many things, it can be a tool that can be used for good, and it can also be misused. So I don't think that outsourcing many of our criminal legal decisions to social media is necessarily a good idea, because while they can provide all kinds of help, right? Because think about how many people you can affect by putting something out on social media. You can get tons of information of varying quality, but you might not have had in a traditional investigation, and that can be really useful. But it can also contribute to things like a mob mentality. It can contribute to all sorts of other problems, and be just as susceptible to all of these different types of error and bias that somebody in a lab, and arguably more because of a lack of background and training. And while I would say that, the background and training that we get for our analysts is inadequate, it certainly is more than, some of the people who are purporting to know more. So I think you have to be awfully careful with that. Also, the people whose cases or whose causes get championed on social media those cases suffer from the same kinds of problems that I was talking about with, getting your application to to whatever innocence effort you're applying to. People feel certain ways about people who look like them, or people whose lives are like theirs, or people, whose story is compelling. And that can also lead to a great deal of inequality. So I think while I think there's a role to play, I think you have to be pretty careful about that kind of investigation.
I think that's an interesting point. I think the media in the crossover between the justice I don't know, how we seek justice and the media's coverage of it. In my mind, the media shouldn't be it should be a reflective body, not something that influences what people think about it, right? They should just report this happened in court today, but instead it's, Nancy Grace explaining her opinions, right, to some extent, and shaping the public's opinion about that. And that's where it's a bigger discussion about media that we could have
For sure.
we could talk for hours, ad nauseum too. But
And I think traditional media and social media present very different challenges.
good point. I think that's a really good point. Now, social media is great at helping us find social media is good at helping us find evidence, or
Sure.
I've seen that a lot on TikTok. TikTok is helping find people and find evidence. So I think that that's a good place to start. I don't know. It's an interesting question about social media. So
It's a super interesting question. I cannot pretend like I have the answers. I think it's really interesting, and I think we should continue to think about it. And just like everything else, I think we have to approach these, issues, new technologies, things like that with some skepticism. We have to, and from a variety of perspectives, so that we can ask ourselves, like, who is this harming? Right? Because if you want to think about like the way that you can get people spun up on social media or on traditional media about a missing I don't know, white child, right? That's very different than the way that, for example, missing and murdered Indigenous women have been treated by
that's right.
both the mainstream media and the, and by others. And so I think that we need to really ask ourselves if we're not, in solving some of our problems, we're not amplifying others.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I've spoken with that a little bit on the other show that I do, that
Mm.
there's that issue. Um, Something that what we were speaking about earlier was uh, when you said there are tests that are developed specifically for or one-time use, right? You were saying like, oh, if the prosecution or someone develops a test that's only used one time in this court case, that's a red flag. Are there other red flags like that? I think we were talking about it before we were recording, so I just wanted to.
Yeah, so uh, that's one example. So, right. And I mean, I don't know how much you want me to, I think we were kind of chatting about it before we got on, and I don't know how much you want me to kind of back up into it, but one thing that is sort of easy to look at and be concerned about is anytime a test is created to serve a particular purpose in one case. So like in our organization filed an amicus brief in the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court about a woman named Kara Rintala. And Kara was wrongfully convicted of the murder of her wife because of some evidence that was clearly sought for that purpose. There was a question about whether paint that had been spilled, and I don't know how far I ought to go into the details because it just takes a long time.
Oh yeah, I understand.
Not because it's a secret, because it takes a long time. But there was a question about whether paint that had been spilled at the crime scene had been intentionally poured or spilled, and how long it had been there. And so they had two trials that ended in hung juries, and then in the third trial, they tried to establish time of death, both with a pathologist and with an expert, a person who they found who worked at a paint company, to testify about how long it might have taken the paint to dry and whether or not it was intentionally poured. And it was astoundingly poor evidence. That's the reason why we weighed in on it. But it was very surprising that those involved in the case for the prosecution didn't seem to register how deeply, deeply problematic it was. And so that's why I think that organizations like ours that are neutral organizations, I mean, of course, we've advocated on behalf of people who we believe are wrongfully convicted or science that we believe is wrong. We're not a traditional partisan organization for the defense or the prosecution. We want to be on the side of good science. And, that's a role for us.
Well, and I think the other way to look at it is no one should be threatened by the work you do, because if they were right the first time, then you'll just confirm their conviction, right? You would think if people were acting in good faith, they'd say, fine, bring it on, because my case is airtight. but if your case isn't airtight, then you have something to hide.
Yeah, I think it's hard to attribute motives to people who fight in an adversarial system. Like that's what we're trained to do as
Fair
lawyers.
enough.
We argue in an adversarial system, sometimes regardless of what we believe. But and that's part of our training. But I do think that, you know, there's no reason for example, prosecution organizations to resist additional forensic testing in a case. And I understand the concerns, right? They're often not hiding something, at least that they know of, right? They're
Mhm.
often thinking like, this person is guilty, this is a hassle, and we're going to end up dredging this all up for potentially a victim or the family of a victim. That's not fair to them. I mean, I can understand the concerns. And it's part of why it's important to improve the system on the front end so that we're not fighting about it all the time on the back end.
That's right. That's right. Similarly, a question that came in was, let's see if I can paraphrase this. There's like a culture of competitiveness, and there's this desire for, prosecutors to win a case. And that seems to be the more important part than getting the right person sometimes. And I was wondering if you could comment on that. Is that something that you see in prosecutorial misconduct? Or I guess, wait, let me back up. You're just talking about, I guess, the evidence collection, because it gets to a prosecutor and they just take it at face value of what the investigator told them, or what the officers told them, maybe not at face value, but and so I can see how one piece kind of goes through, you just have one faulty piece of evidence and it goes through the chain. And then you were mentioning earlier, there's a bias, like a handoff bias almost. Oh yeah, this is for this case, that guy's definitely guilty. Here, see if you can put him in the garage, right, or whatever. And I guess, like, there's no safeguard to this kind of thing unless we put them in place, right? So we need to strengthen policies or laws. And that comes to one of the other questions that I wanted to ask is, like, is there legislation in place? Are you guys working on legislation to produce? I know you said you're not nonpartisan, but not all legislation has to be partisan, right?
Right. So we're not a lobbying organization, but we definitely are available to weigh in on issues related to this, whether it's in the judicial, legislative, or executive branch, whether those are, executive guidelines, judicial opinions, all of those places, we're advocates for the science.
I see. So if someone was going to draft legislation, they might consult you.
Sure, absolutely. And we'd be happy to do that. And I think have some expertise in those kinds of questions for sure. Yeah.
I think that's kind of like, for me, I would like to see it head in that direction, because I don't think, I mean, otherwise, what are the options? Just trying to get individual jurisdictions to change their policies?
Well, I think that so ideally the way that our system is supposed to work is that accusations are well vetted by the investigators and the prosecutors bringing the case, and perhaps most importantly, they are adequately adversarially tested. That means that there's that assumes an equal footing or near equal footing of lawyers for both sides. And that is, as you know, in our system, not often true, and in fact, almost never true. I don't know, I hate saying never, but if it's ever true, it's not very often. And so part of what we do as an organization is help lawyers who might be facing these kinds of cases understand where the failings might be, where they need to challenge or look more deeply at something. And we do that for prosecution agencies, and we've done trainings for prosecutors and things like that. But I would say the vast majority of concerned lawyers who get in touch with us are defense lawyers. And that's because if the system is working for you, you're not necessarily able to recognize how poorly it's working for others.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, right? Well, it worked for me, so why doesn't it work for you? How many times have we heard that in other things, right?
Right.
That's awesome. I guess I have one final question that was submitted. I'm going to paraphrase this one a little bit too. And if you could just, like, maybe this is partially a recap as well of just kind of the entire conversation that we've had. You said linear, sequential unmasking was one way. to improve the evidence collection ipso facto,
Analysis.
yeah, ipso facto the justice system, right? So by default, you would be strengthening the justice system. So you have linear. What are some other ones? Do you have a couple other, maybe off the top of your head, other than linear sequential unmasking?
Yeah, linear sequential unmasking is really just a technique to try to avoid an analyst from getting biasing information after the evidence is collected and they're actually setting about the task of analyzing it. That's really what that particular technique is used for when it is used, which is not perhaps not often enough. Actually, definitely
Right.
not often enough.
Right.
One thing that almost every advocate for criminal legal reform has suggested, and I think it is spot on and very important, is simply removing crime labs from law enforcement and making them totally independent all the time.
Well, I
Much as
think that's
medical laboratories can be independent.
right. I think that's a target that makes a lot of sense, right? It's just it would remove any potential for problems, right? If there's literally brick walls and locks between law enforcement and evidence, it eliminates the potential for bad actors, right? Unless you knew
That's
someone,
true.
unless you knew someone inside. So I mean, not completely. You could say, well, hey, my friend works inside the evidence, where we house the evidence, but what I'm
Right.
saying is, like, yeah, just taking that out. So when whoever collects the evidence, isn't necessarily law enforcement, they're
Well,
not
it
sheriff,
could
I guess is what I'm saying.
be.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily, and I think that there are a lot of different ideas about how it would be right to go about evidence collection, but certainly the storage and analysis and processing of evidence doesn't have there's no need for that to be a law enforcement task. That it is easily done by an independent organization, and there are places where it is done by an independent organization, and while those people are just as susceptible to bad actors and failings and other kinds of issues, what this does is it reduces a phenomenon known as role effects biasing, which means that when you see yourself as part of a team, you tend to act in the best interests of that team, right? So if you see yourself on the prosecution team, then that is the lens through which you view yourself and your actions. By removing law enforcement oversight from crime labs, what we can do is we can start to reduce the role effects bias that can sometimes be responsible for some of these bad outcomes.
Right. And as they say, they have enough to do anyway. So let's just take that off their plate for them.
I mean, I do think that there is something to be said for this idea that there are plenty of tasks in our society that are being handled by law enforcement that would be best handled by somebody else.
Yeah, I think so too. I think, we have this hangover from like a Western cowboy kind of type thing where the only person in town that was trustworthy was the sheriff and he handled it all. And we just kind of, well, why not just, no, because we've evolved. We need to find the better ways. We don't need one person or one department to do all this, cat up a tree.
And it isn't fair to those people.
That's right. Cat up a tree, murder victim. No, how about you just handle the heavy stuff and leave the cat up a tree, or this, or as to a bigger conversation, if there's a domestic, or there's a someone with a mental illness problem, well, send in people who are trained for that, not just someone that can arrest them and throw them in the tank, right? Like, we need real solutions to real problems, not just throw them in the tank, lock them up and throw them in the tank. That's my opinion.
And certainly no need for law enforcement to be overseeing the work of a crime lab. It's not necessary.
There you go.
Just like we don't have law enforcement overseeing medical laboratories. It's not necessary.
Right. Yeah.
Scientists should oversee other scientists.
Yeah, I like that. That's right where I'm at. I'm right there with you, I should say.
I mean, if you think about this from any other context, and really like our organization advocates for crime labs to be run much more like medical laboratories with all the attendant safeguards and rules. And necessarily they will be different, right? But the same idea is nice to apply there. And if you're a doctor and you're investigating somebody's illness, you don't tell the patient, okay, well, I need to test your level of whatever in your blood, draw the blood and run the analysis. Although I think that may have been true long ago, right? Now what you do is you give the order, you move on to your next patient to do the other thing. Somebody draws the blood, somebody does the analysis, they give you the information, and you use that to synthesize your conclusion, right? And I don't think there's any reason why this has to work any differently. Certainly it will be important, right, for crime labs to continue to do good work and to give the results of their investigations to law enforcement to continue their investigation, but the intertwining of those is unnecessary and harmful.
And I think that, this concept of decentralization, where there isn't this central power that's doing everything. If things are decentralized and this person has a small job to do this, and then this person has a singular purpose to do this, when there is a breakdown in evidence, it's easier to track back and find that breakdown, instead of one person saying, well, I was responsible for this evidence and I have my way of doing things, right? And there's no standard. And it just, anyway, so I just think like
what you
say
important
is,
for people. Yeah, I was just gonna say it's important for people to be able to connect to a better goal. But when we're talking about forensic science and forensic science analysts, what that goal should be is to serve the science, not to serve some other purpose.
That's right. I just think that that's such a great point. Is there anything else that you'd like to add to our conversation? Is there anything that you felt we missed, or something I missed to talk about?
No, I don't think so.
I'm really happy that you're here, and thank you again.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. The most common thing I get asked is, what can people do to help, right? And so what we want people to know is that they can help in a number of ways. They can give, right? They can give money, they can volunteer their time, they can give in other ways, right? They can vote, so they can choose what they're going to support and whom they're going to support for different kinds of offices, and choose their values in that way. Voting might also include voting with your dollars, deciding that if you care about and this is not necessarily central to our mission, but if you care about people after they have been released from incarceration having meaningful and productive lives, then maybe what you do is you support a business who hires those folks, or you support charities who support those folks, and then also learn. So one way you can do that is by following us on social media and attending our events, and you can learn more about the system and the ways in which it could be reformed, so that you are an informed citizen, helping to push us towards more equity in this system.
Well, thank you so much for that. I think that's just a great way to cap off our conversation, and I'm sure we'll generate more questions. And I'm sure, and as soon as I get off with you, I'll think of 10 more things that I could have asked you. So I'll send those questions your way eventually. And it's just great to have you on, and thanks again. So for those of you out there listening, this has been Katherine Judson from the Center of Integrity in Forensic Sciences. And I just want to say thanks again, and that will conclude the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really important conversation.
Thank you. Bye.